Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about, or at this moment, we're going to talk about the avant garde from Dada to Surrealism. So, how do we get from Dada to Surrealism? So, as I mentioned a little bit in a previous lecture, Dada began in Switzerland during World War I by artists who escaped the war, and it was neutral. Switzerland was a neutral, so they were fine there, and they were interested in sort of this ironic, irrational, unusual juxtapositions. The photogram got a lot of attention there, and photomontage. After the war, Dada had its branches in Berlin, New York, and Paris. And guess what? They just decided it was time for the death of Dada. They actually had a funeral for Dada and in Paris. And this gave rise to Surrealism, an art form based on writing and literature rather than the visual arts. So there's two major strains when we think about Surrealism. The one is dream interpretation, and that's influenced by Freud, and automatism, so free association, stream of consciousness. So photography became an important component to Surrealist practice. It was used to illustrate journals because they could combine text and image. There was this expression of doubling. Photograms became important, and these were made by Man Ray, and he called them rayographs. So this is a seamless unity of print versus the cut of montage. So there's kind of it's less abstraction or abstraction in a different way. Solarization is another art form within photography. So this kind of spacing, indication of break in simultaneous experience of the real. Distortion in mirrors becomes important. And we see distortion in Salvador Dali's work. We think of melting watches and melting clocks. Well, the photographer Andre Cortez is going to do distortions as well. We have stop action in Henri Cartier-Bresson's Decisive Moment. And we have mimicry, instances in nature when one thing imitates another. So the influence with Freud, he published The Interpretation of Dreams in 1900 with ideas of the self, inner states of mind, sexuality, and identity. That was followed by Carl Jung's The Psychology of the Unconscious. So these important ways of thinking influence art and photography of the time, and particularly among the Surrealists. In Paris in 1925, a man by the name of André Breton, he worked at a psychiatric hospital that used Freud's concepts for therapy. And so then he sort of borrowed that idea, and because he was associated with a group of artists, then he began to apply some of Freud's studies in bringing out ideas of the unconscious with these artists through seances, hypnosis, drugs. So the first artist that we'll look at is Man Ray. So while Man Ray is an American, born in America, and his real name is Emanuel Rednitsky, but he took on the name Man Ray. He was a painter, an illustrator, filmmaker, and photographer. He kind of was interested in all of the different art forms. He saw a lot of art, and I'm just going to go to this for a second, art at the Armory Show in 1913 in New York City. So this was a show of modern art, and it brought together artists from America, but more importantly at this moment, it brought together a lot of artists from Europe who were experimenting in all the art forms we've been talking about, Cubism and Futurism, etc., etc. So Man Ray made this early painting, and it was inspired by some of the art forms that he had seen. I believe it looks a little like a Matisse painting. So just to go back here for a minute, in 1921, he met Duchamp in New York, and they became friends and sort of collaborated on some different things. And so in 1921, he and Duchamp go to Paris to make a movie. And so he became, at that point, associated with the Parisian Dada and later Surrealists. I'm just going to show you some of his early works. This is one inspired, as I said, by the 1913 Armory Show. He also did a London Underground poster, and this was a really popular art form for all artists to be commissioned to make a poster which was positioned on view in the London subway. So keeps London going. These two art forms I'm showing you now really reflect his Dada influences. This is on the left called The Gift, and there is one on a display at the Art Institute. It's basically an iron with these little metal spikes coming, a row of tacks glued to the bottom. And it was called The Gift. And if someone gave that to you as a gift, I think you would question what they thought of you. And then the object on the right is called An Object to be Destroyed, made in 1923. And this object was destroyed by anti-Dada rioters in 1957. So, as I said, he and Duchamp had sort of a collaboration, and here's Duchamp sort of role-playing. He plays a woman, Rose C'est la Vie, and then we can see that on the left. He even signs it Rose C'est la Vie. And then we see the image on the lower right, which is the photograph that might have been made for to go on the perfume bottle. So Belle Hélène is the perfume bottle on which Duchamp's photograph appears. It is an art object. It wasn't produced. Another collaboration between the two kind of came accidentally. When Duchamp and Man Ray leave for Paris, Duchamp has started this project. It's a huge piece of glass that's sitting on two horses, wooden horses, in the studio. So you've got this big sheet of glass, and they go to Paris, and when they come back after many, many months, maybe longer, this is what the plate of glass looks like. And Man Ray photographs it, and he titles it Breeding Ground of Dust, 1920s. So it's made out of the sheet of glass, that's the basis, that's the subject, the sheet of glass covered in dust. And it is actually the early stages of Duchamp's painting, and you can see a little lines on kind of the right-hand side. So this work of art is sort of experimental. There's this sense of irony, and it's the absurd. And this one becomes quite popular. It ends up being published in a surrealist journal, and it gets a lot of attention. Well, here you can see Duchamp's finished work on the left. It was Duchamp's Bride stripped bare by her bachelors. So it was a painting on glass, and when the handlers came to take it to be put on exhibition, they accidentally dropped it, and you can see the cracks in it. And Duchamp was known to have said, "Aha, at last, it's done." So anyway, it's kind of interesting collaboration. One more of that. So Man Ray does a lot of different work when he's in Paris, and he does work wherever he is for advertisements. He does portraiture, for money. Again, he has a studio. He has many people working for him. At one time, Lee Miller was his assistant. At one time, Berenice Abbott was his assistant. I think something like this for Remington typewriter, it's an interesting close-up and an interesting sort of angle from which it's shot, it makes it more abstract and more interesting and emphasizes kind of the materials. And then he kind of starts working on solarization. So this is his assistant Lee Miller, and I don't know what you know about solarization, but it's a strategy of spacing that renders part of the photographic image negative and part positive by exposing a print or negative to a flash of light during development. And he was one of the first, Man Ray was one of the first artists to use this technique in 1929. However, it had been used back in the early part of the 19th century, back in 1840, and it was known then as the Sabatier effect. But this strategy of spacing indicates a break in the simultaneous experience of the real, this idea of doubling. So this kind of idea becomes really a fun experimentation for the surrealists, or any surrealists who were trying this. So here's another one, Sleeping Woman. It's again his assistant Lee Miller, and then this idea of her sleeping, it kind of relates to the idea of dream interpretation or dreaming, and we see that a bit in this work. And Woman and Mask. Now this one is, I think, truly fabulous. I mean, it's kind of a fashion photograph. It has this dreamlike quality. Again, this is actually Kiki Parnasse. She was a Parisian, and we have this dreamlike quality because her head is, of course, down in the sleeping position. Her eyes are closed. But there's that idea of mimicry because her lips and her closed eyes sort of mimic the African mask. Now, in the early part of the 20th century, African objects were very popular in Paris. They were brought to Paris, and artists were inspired by them and used them in their work. And I think this is kind of an interesting, even her hair, the way it's slicked down, kind of reiterates that stylized hairdo of the mask. And then, as I mentioned, he was, or maybe I didn't mention, but he was one that tried the photogram, and this was supposedly an accident, but as I said, photograms were done early 19th century. So one day he accidentally set a glass funnel, a graduate, and a thermometer on a piece of photographic paper. Man Ray noticed, I turned on the light. Before my eyes, an image began to form, not quite a simple silhouette of the objects, as in a straight photograph, but distorted and refracted by the glass more or less in contact with the paper. So when exposed to light, the birth of rayographs, as somebody nicknamed them. So these were cast objects against sensitized paper exposed to a light source. So they couldn't control the results. You just have the trace of the object. It's sort of a delicate aestheticism and resembles Picasso-type imagery. So in 1922, let me see if I have one more. Yeah, in 1922, a book of his collected rayographs were published, and it was called The Delightful Fields. It was published with an introduction by a Dada artist, Tristan Tzara, who admired the enigmatic quality of Man Ray's images. So the rayogram that you're looking at, there's an interest in form, seamless unity of the print, and there's no cut like the photo montage. Here's something you might want to do in your spare time. Man Ray also made films. In one short film called Return to Reason, and I know it's on YouTube and it's just a couple minutes long, he applied the rayograph technique to motion picture film, making patterns with salt, pepper, tacks, and prints. And there's another film called The Star of the Sea, which is considered a surrealist classic. In 1940, Man Ray escaped the German occupation of Paris by moving to Los Angeles. He returned to Paris in 1946 and continued to paint and experiment until his death. His autobiography, Self-Portrait, was published in 1963. So another person whose work might be considered along the line of, well, definitely along the line of modernism and maybe hints at surrealism, which is the French artist Henri Cartier-Bresson. He was a former painter and student of art history, known for what's termed the decisive moment, which he defined as the simultaneous recognition in a fraction of a second of the significance of an event, as well as of a precise organization of forms, which give, oh, I see how I've screwed up here, give something, something, its proper expression. So what's interesting about Cartier-Bresson, he did a lot of essay work for magazines, and he said the important thing is when you're doing essay work, you have to remember the picture you just took and the picture you're taking now, and make sure you didn't miss something in between, because you don't want to go back and pull out all your pictures and realize you missed something in the sequence that was really important. So, yeah, I think we can talk a little bit about the decisive moment here in this picture, Madrid, Spain, where we see the boys playing, and one or two of them sort of is looking at the photographer, interested in the photographer. You've got this contrast with the windows against the white wall, which looks very random, and then the way the man is just moving in the middle ground straight across, I think is very, like, everything worked perfectly, which shows that he had this wonderful eye for catching that particular wonderful coincidence, if it will be a coincidence. And then this Sunday on the banks of the River Marne in 1938. I've looked at this a couple times and thought, yeah, this is interesting, but the more you look at it, it doesn't look like much, but it really is interesting because you're looking at the backs of people. You don't see their faces. That's kind of interesting. And then the boat is all sitting in front of them, and the question is, did they come on the boat? Yes, I think they did. Yes, we can think they did. It seems obvious. But then, too, there's interesting things like one wine bottle is already empty. The man is pouring another wine bottle. There's the empty plates, and they brought real plates and silverware to their picnic. I don't know. It's just kind of one of those cozy, really interesting moments. So he does capture moments in time. And all of you know the Behind the Gare St. Lazare. And this one is cool. Whether he had this set up, asked somebody to leap over some water, I don't know. You can only just guess. But you've got this, it brings out all the repetition and rhythm. And you've got repetition of the fence in the water. You've got the repetition of the man jumping over. It's repeated in his shadow in the water. It's repeated in the dancer. It pulls from the dancer on the poster. So it's got all these wonderful shapes. I just think this is just a classic, the decisive moment. But there's many by Bresson. This one's at the Valencia Arena, and I think some of the objects here are just, when I say objects, elements here are quite interesting. The man's round glasses that are hit just perfectly with the light then mimics this sort of circular target that's on this fence or doorway that he's looking through, and his kind of peering attitude. He's kind of got a surly look a little bit, or a distrusting look maybe. And then this other young man kind of looks like he's entering the arena. So it's like simultaneously things are going on. And this one too, it's kind of the scary moment. You got two brothers and lots of shadows and angles and darks and lights, and it's quite a wonderful moment in Seville, Spain. So André Cortez was Hungarian. He was a friend of Versailles, if you are at all familiar with Versailles. He's also Hungarian, and Andre Cortez has an interesting career, and I think in a way it has some parallel with some of the works that CartierBresson did. So Andre Cortez bought a camera at the age of 18 with savings from his job at the Budapest Stock Exchange, and he sought the drama of the streets. In 1915, he joined the army to fight in World War II, took his camera along as an optical diary. His interest in the human form began initially when he photographed bodies of swimmers refracted in a pool. And he turned at one point to this Distortion series that he did really just for a very short time. And he was able to accomplish this using a funhouse mirror from a Parisian amusement park. And he worked on these distortion figures for 4 weeks and got 200 negatives out of it. And it kind of reminds you of things like Munch's Scream, which is 1893. So he was in Paris in 1925, so he's there when all of these other artists, there's this, after World War I, there's a lot of movement to Paris where a big art community exists, so this is a perfect working environment for Cortez. Here's another image, Satiric Dancer, where it's not quite a distorted figure, but it's a figure that replicates distortion, perhaps. And it also sort of mimics the sculpture that's on the pedestal next to her. He gets to know a lot of the Parisian or the French artists. Mondrian, he does a lot of photographing in Mondrian's studio. This one is Mondrian's Pipe and Glasses, 1926. So this responds to that idea of new vision, new objectivity, but conveys the artist's own vision. And here we have the composition of these works sort of echo Mondrian's paintings. But it's very simple, yet very, it could be an advertisement. It is simple. It's direct. You've got the wonderful sort of triangles on either side in the upper part of the image, the wonderful just solid white background of the table, and then the glasses and the pipe, which accent that white. So really artistic ways of representing the everyday. And then this one, Carrefour Blanc, is a street scene from above. And again, sometimes you look at something like this and you're going, that's interesting, but you have to look at it longer. I think that's what's interesting at the top, sort of middle and coming down from the street, there's this wonderful ray of light. So that's one thing. But you could look at it as being the old and the new, because you see old methods of transportation, a horse and a cart, and then someone on a bicycle, a little bit more modern, but then at one point you can see someone on a motorcycle. So it's just all these wonderful ideas that you can see. And then obviously he's working from this upper vantage point, so you're looking down, which creates new shapes. You've got the curve of the sidewalk in one place, you've got sort of angles of a building on another. It's really geometric. And for those of you who love that rule of thirds, which you've taught me a lot, in each kind of corner you've got an object that might be considered the rule of thirds. And also the repetition in tiles. So it's a wonderful image, wonderful. So Cortez. And then lastly, I think this is the last one that I'm going to show you at this moment. So this is Moudon, France, and Moudon is a suburb of Paris. And when the first time I looked at this, I thought, this is okay. But it's one of those that you start looking at and you find more and more interesting things. And here again, I think this is his answer to the decisive moment, because he has the train coming along this viaduct kind of a track on the upper edges of the photograph. So The train is coming from right to left. Then he has the man here carrying a parcel. He's going from left to right. So you've got those kind of movements. You have interesting framing, heavier with a building on the left, just a little slip of a building on the right. But then if you think about some other things, he's got, you see the two kind of arches in the back, then the three men that are observing this new construction. It's a very complex piece. And I hope you enjoyed our little introduction to the Surrealists.